people are still coming in, but let us start. So to everyone who's coming here from all the places, we're getting people, looks like everyone so far is in North America. That sometimes we go beyond those bounds. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. We are delighted this evening. We're thrilled this evening to, we being Elliott Bay Book Company, which is here in Seattle on Duwamish land. We are thrilled, though I'm part of the problem is I've been so excited to be presenting this program, long awaited and much anticipated, with Suzanne Simard, the author of this extraordinary book, Finding the Mother Tree, which was published last week, 6 days ago, last Tuesday. I've worked at our bookstore for many years, and there have been few books where I've been as excited and pestering even the publisher as long as I have about when this book was coming. And now that day is upon us, and we're delighted and honored and thrilled that Suzanne is joining us from her home in Nelson, British Columbia, to talk about this book, which draws on her work over the years. It draws on her whole life's work of knowing and seeking to know and understand the trees that we live among and that live among us, and how they relate to each other in ways that Western science and our practices of working with trees and using trees and living with trees haven't really taken account of. And it's an extraordinary tale she tells. Tonight, she will be talking about that. And one of the things, many things that happen in this book is she encounters surprises, because the book is really set largely in the field, in among the trees, among the forests, and there's encounters with unexpected others. So in tonight's happening, where we plan to have Suzanne here on Monday, until a day or so ago, the plan was that I would be doing the conversation with her. But this past Friday, we had the pleasure in this very same time of hosting the writer Sarah Sentilles, who has herself written a new book, which also came out a week ago, last Tuesday, called Stranger Care. Sarah and Cheryl Strayed did a conversation about Sarah's book, which is in great part about her and her husband's quest to become foster parents, but really is a deep exploration of what it is to be a parent and to be raised, and how we raise, and what a family is, and who among us, is looked after. And it's a very smart, moving book, including for the ways it reads situations beyond what you might think. And early in the book, she quotes earlier writing by Suzanne Simard about trees and their relation to each other. And in the conversation we had last Friday with Sarah, we asked about Suzanne's book. Did she know about the book? Because we're telling everyone we know. And she says, oh, I would love to read it. I would love to meet her. I would love to see her. And my colleague Karen says, well, what are you doing on Monday? So in quick order, she has read Suzanne's book and will bring to this, I think, a wonderful kind of, not only a fresh reader's eye, but it's a very knowing eye. She's even been to Nelson. She lives in central Idaho. So these two are actually in some physical proximity to each other. So Sarah will do the conversation with Suzanne and cover the ground they cover. And we hope you will put questions in as well. And I will come in later and work with those in for what this is. This book has so many stories within it, and that just to get it going, and I know people have already been getting the book, which just came out, but many more will as well. So I'm going to stop talking now and to say thank you all again for joining us. And now please join in giving your good warm attention and virtual applause to Suzanne Simard and Sarah Sentilles. Thank you both.
Hi, Suzanne. I'm so grateful to Rick and Karen for inviting me to talk to you. I just feel it's such a huge gift. Your writing and your work has really shaped my own thinking about the natural world and my own thinking about humans and our responsibilities to each other. At the heart of Stranger Care is that question: who do we care for and why? Who do we not care for and why? And I think you really expose our limited stories about what counts as family and who should be tended, and what our responsibilities are to each other and to this planet and the beings we share it with. So first, would you like to read something? I think you said you'd like to read, and then we'll begin.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And I'm really delighted that I get to meet you, and I'm looking forward to reading your book as well. And also thank you, Elliott Bay Bookstore, for having me. I really, really appreciate this. So I'm going to read a little passage from a chapter called 9-Hour Commute. And just as a preamble to this is when I was a young mother. My kids were 4 and 6 years old, and I was commuting between my university and my home in Nelson, and it's a 9-hour commute. And I had stopped partway along to look at a forest that one of my graduate students, Kevin Byler, was going to use to map the Wood Wide Web. So here we go. I ran my thumb across the tip of my trowel to make sure it was sharp, and followed a thick root running from the base of my first old tree to where it tapered to the width of a finger. And I sliced open the forest floor in search of rusty brown truffles, the scabby below-ground mushrooms of rhizopogon. The trowel cut through the litter and fermentation layers and split open the humus to reveal the dense grains of underlying minerals, where the drizzles of humus and the weathered clays came to rest, and roots and mycorrhizas foraged for nutrients. After half an hour, mosquitoes biting my forehead, my knees sore on twigs, I hit a truffle, the size of a patisserie chocolate. It was resting smack between the humus layer and the mineral horizon, and I scraped away the organic crumbs and found a beard of black fungal threads running from one end of the truffle to the old tree's roots. I followed another pulpy skein in another direction, and it led me to a cluster of root tips that looked like white translucent pussy toes, which is a kind of plant. The fine, soft brush I'd borrowed from Hannah, my daughter's paint set, was perfect for sweeping them clean. One root tip was especially welcoming, and I tugged it, like pulling a stray thread in a hem. A seedling, a hand's length away, shuddered slightly. I pulled again, harder, and the seedling leaned back in resistance. I looked at my old tree, then at the little seedling in the shadows. The fungus was linking the old tree and the young seedling. A shock of nearby willows shivered, and a yellow butterfly flittered across the meadow. The wind shifted. I looked over at the grasses hemming the fold of trees, blades ringing, tingling. My eyes were attuned to the edges, where consortiums of bears and coyotes and birds linger and banter, but there was no movement. I tracked another root from the elder and found another truffle, and another. I raised each to my nose and breathed in its musty, earthy smell of spores and mushroom and birth. I traced the black pulpy whiskers from each truffle to the riggings of roots of seedlings of all ages and saplings too. With each unearthing, the framework unfolded. This old tree was connected to every one of the younger trees regenerated around it. Later, one of my graduate students, Kevin Byler, would return to this patch and sequence the DNA of almost every rhizopogon truffle and the trees, and found that most of the trees were linked together by the rhizopogon mycelium, and that the biggest, oldest trees were connected to almost all of the younger ones in their neighborhood. One tree was linked to 47 others, some of them 20 meters away. One tree bound to the next, and we figured the whole forest was connected by rhizopogon alone. We published these findings in 2010, followed by further details in 2 more papers. If we'd been able to map how the other 60 fungal species connected the firs, we surely would have found the weave much thicker, the layers deeper, the stitching even more intricate. Not to mention the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi adding interstitial components to such a map, as they possibly joined the grasses and herbs and shrubs in an independent web. And the ericoid mycorrhizas linking the huckleberries in their own network, and the orchid mycorrhizas with their own too. And that's that passage.
It's so beautiful. I'm so glad you read it too, because I would have mispronounced so many of those words. I'm curious if you read your own audiobook or not.
Yes, I did actually.
Yeah, you had to.
Yeah.
So I want to start with this idea of a creed. Kind of in the middle of the book, you write that you have a creed, and your creed is nothing should be lost. Everything has a purpose. Everything is in need of care. So can you tell us more about this creed and how it shapes you and how you look at the world?
Yeah, I think just it's the history of my life. I grew up in these old growth forests where, everything grew together. There was just a tangle and abundance and diversity of plants. And my grandfather, who was a horse logger, he was very, very careful about taking only the trees that he needed, just the odd tree, and leaving the forest intact. And then, when I started in forestry was so different. It was like we were trying to dismantle the forest, take out members of the forest that were naturally there, so that we had this idea that we could control the forest, that we could make it what we wanted, right? These rows of trees, seedlings and trees eventually that would feed our marketplace, which was insatiable and still is. And I saw that what we were doing was actually killing the forest instead of the other way around. Instead of making it more productive, it was actually making it less productive. And of course, way, way less diverse. And I started, as I always knew in my heart that this diversity was important, but now we know, and scientists have measured how all the creatures in the forest, they work together to form this system, that their relationships with each other and their presence is absolutely essential to the functioning and structure of a forest. And it turns out, like all communities, our own as well, diversity matters. And so, yeah, so, I understand now that, and especially after watching foresters trying to pluck out the parts that they thought they didn't like, right? They would just say, oh, we don't need those alders. We don't need those nice orchids. We don't need, the pyrolas. We're going to get rid of them. And how arrogant of us, right? And then the forest falling apart after that, and really hitting home to me, not just through the science, but also my observations and my own understanding of forests, that we need to keep all these parts, just like Aldo Leopold said, all those parts work together.
I love that you use the word arrogance, because one of the things I was thinking about when reading your book is how much your book is about our human misseeing, or our misunderstanding of the world, our human failure to see. And I think, I do a lot of writing about racism, and I think, racism at its root, in addition to being structural, is also about our misseeing of each other, and our deciding that we understand a person and we can treat them a certain way. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the failure to see and the damage that causes, and how your work is an antidote to that.
What a great question. Our failure to see underlies so many problems, and our misunderstanding that we understand systems, social systems, as well as ecological systems. There's a certain element of systems that is unknowable, that is magical, that makes it, this whole and vibrant place, including our cities, including our ecosystems. And, the thinking in science that we can actually understand and predict almost everything to 100% would be great, and so that we can absolutely predict how the future will look, and in our in the way that we want it to look, and then and thinking that we can do that, like why did we ever think that? But we did, and that has led socially, environmentally, to so many problems. And so that those parts of those unknowable parts, those important rare parts, or even not even rare, but less more marginal parts, they're all so important. In fact, sometimes those smallest things, those most insignificant, what seem insignificant are some of the most significant parts that make these systems work.
That's so interesting, because my background is in theology. I'm not a religious person anymore, but what I'm interested in about a religion is the capacity to live in mystery. You know, you have fundamentalism, but then you have this other kind where it's about what can't be known and the humility that requires if all of our human constructions will fall short. And in that book we were talking about earlier called Vibrant Matter by Jane Bennett, she talks about this idea that we knowers should be haunted by the nagging feeling that something's been left out. And I think that you in your scientific practice took that, like you were haunted by these things that you saw and by the nagging feeling that we were missing things. So it feels to me like your work is an antidote to that kind of fundamentalism that can plague science, or the idea that we can know things for sure and then turn it towards the use for capitalism or whatever kind of system they want to use.
No, that's a really good analogy. I think that I never thought of like the science as fundamentalism, but you're right, the analogy is basically very, very similar. It's you know, that we can tear it down to its parts, we can understand it, we can control it. And you know, in scientific theory we call that top down, right? That we can superimpose our if it's religion or our worldview, or you know, even you know, that this idea that the marketplace can control everything, when really though so much about the world is that diversity has got to work together to make those parts of it that make it such a wonderful, beautiful place for us to live in these areas, right? Or on this earth. It matters so much, these small invisible things.
Yes. So at one point in the book, you make a promise to the trees that you will, and I was wondering if you could talk about that promise and how it connects to your writing of this book. And my cat is making an appearance.
Yes. Well, you know, I had cancer, right? And I think I wrote this after I recovered from cancer, or I was in recovery. And, you know, it was such a struggle, that whole period of my life. And it had that cancer had come right at a time when I had just left I was just freshly divorced from my husband. I was struggling with trying to keep up with my work. I was exhausted. I was watching our forests in British Columbia getting, degraded. I was heartsick about that. You know, it's a kind of a grief, really. And I felt, after I'd survived all this stuff and watching the forest still suffering, and we still hadn't corrected our behavior, even though I was getting better, that I felt I owed the forest back, what I'd learned. And also because, one of the things that healed me was the chemistry of the yew tree, which I live around yew trees and cedar trees, and paclitaxel is one of the defense enzymes that the yew naturally produces. Actually, also endophytic fungi that live inside of the yew tree also produce paclitaxel, which is really interesting. And anyway, it saved my life. And I thought, well, you know what, I'll try not to go on about this too much, but as an example of how our behavior that I was trying to correct in some ways was that when they discovered paclitaxel in the yew tree, it was actually the USDA that had made a list of all these plants that had anti-cancer agents in them. And they had learned most of this information about plants from the Aboriginal people of North America. So they'd actually gotten, Aboriginal knowledge, and they started screening these plants for medicines. And the yew tree was high up on the list because the Aboriginal people had used the tinctures and potions that, the rubbing their skin to treat, different ailments. And anyway, so they discovered the chemistry of paclitaxel, and as soon as they figured out that it would actually have these strong anti-cancer agents, that the people started like harvesting yew trees from forests like crazy in British Columbia. I would go to the forest and the trees would be completely stripped of their bark because it was in the cambium, and it was like capitalism gone amok, right? Except it was like horrifying. And and then they discovered, how to synthesize paclitaxel, and then the yew trees recovered. But that was just like that moment. And I thought, we need to really give back to these trees because, they've given us so much. And we, it's our responsibility to look after what has given us, life and medicine and to make sure that we sort of honor what the Aboriginal people knew, and they cared for these plants, and what right did we have to go in and destroy them? Anyway, another part to this story is that, so we're synthesizing paclitaxel in labs. And I thought, those trees, it's a defense compound for them. When they get attacked by insects or pathogens, they produce taxol or paclitaxel, and it's their own defense chemistry. And so I thought, what if we grew these yew trees in like they grow in naturally in forests in the understory under big old growth cedar with maples, and they form an arbuscular mycorrhizal network. That's different. It's odd. It's their own unique little patch. And I thought, what if the neighborhood matters to paclitaxel production? The natural production. Maybe the quality of the taxol would be better. Maybe the quantity would be better. Maybe it would produce a more potent medicine. And so that's what I'm doing right now. I have a graduate student, Eva Snyder, and we've just discovered that these trees are these arbuscular mycorrhizal trees, the maple, yew, and cedar that form a little community, are all linked together in the forest. And now Eva actually this very day is labeling the plants with isotopes to try and figure out how it's affecting movement of carbon and other compounds between the trees, and whether or not it's going to affect paclitaxel production. So I truly am giving back, and that is my own humble small way of trying to do that.
That's really powerful and beautiful. And I see that you talked about Aboriginal knowledge and Indigenous knowledge, and there's a question in the chat that I can see, and that was one of my questions also, which is, a lot of times Indigenous knowledge or Aboriginal knowledge knows things about the earth that science denied for decades and decades and decades and decades, and then science claims it as their own idea. So I was wondering if you could you write about it in the book, but wondering if you could talk about the relationship between science and Indigenous or Aboriginal knowledge, and how you navigate and think about that.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So Aboriginal knowledge, they is knowledge that's accumulated over thousands of years, and it's scientific. It's science is observation and testing, and looking for patterns and repeatability of patterns. And that's what Aboriginal people did as well as us. We claim that we invented science, I think, but really that's absolutely not true. That's very arrogant of Western science to think that was the invention of science. The Aboriginal science has been around for thousands of years, and they had discovered long time ago, I didn't know this, but that these fungal networks actually run through the soil and link trees together. And the Coast Salish people actually think of the trees and the fungal associations as as a one whole system, and also give respect to these trees and fungi, as equal to themselves. That these trees are of equal stature as humans, and that is actually not just that's not a small worldview. That's an incredibly wholehearted worldview, and that is and it's expressed, in for example, Subiye, who is from who was a Skokomish man. He's since passed away, but he in his writings called the trees the tree people. And just as Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book Braiding Sweetgrass calls the strawberries the strawberry people. So this is just an expression of equality, right? And respect and reciprocity in the giving and taking of honor and respect. And that's the part where Western science falls down, is that Western science is good at observation and good at testing, but has always viewed people as outside of the scientific endeavor, that we're not part of it, that our subjects are kind of inferior to us, and we're the superior observers, and that we manipulate these things, and then we look at the little reduced parts and try to understand it. But in so doing, we miss the whole mystery, because or parts of the mystery anyway, because we're trying to look at all these little reduced parts, and then we try to put it back together and say, oh, this is how it works. But you can't really, you can't do a brain scan and then understand how you're thinking, right? That's kind of a good analogy. Like there's so much more to it that we are not ever really going to understand that magical part. And but it doesn't matter so much as long as you understand that the wholeness is important, and that keeping all the parts and respecting them is important. And that's what leads to good stewardship of land and stewardship of societies as well, is respecting all those parts, even if they're invisible to you and they're not part of your reductionist way of seeing the world.
Yes, beautiful. One of the things I love about how you write is the way that you use language, and how you apply language that we reserve for humans, like the human centered worldview of the West, and you apply it to the rest of the world. I mean, one of the ones that took my breath away was you called cutting down trees an execution, when you were marking the clear cutting boundaries. Yes. Execution, family, mother, children, kin, all that language, and you apply it to trees. So I'm wondering if you can talk about why you think we have resistance to seeing the aliveness or the family structures in the rest of creation, or the rest of the planet.
I think this idea that the world is there for us to use, which really has got a long history in Western religions and Western philosophies, and the separation of man from nature, from mind from body. It again, comes down to if you can't, and if we don't understand it, that it doesn't really exist, or it's not important. And we really have so much focused, in the last, especially since our theories of evolution have come up, with Darwin, about thinking that, that we interact in such simplified ways, that communities of trees and forests interact in simplified ways, which is based on competition and domination, and survival of the fittest, when in fact, that there's this whole complexity of the way things interact and behave and have relationships, just like in our human societies. But by ignoring that complexity, or by reducing it down to something that we thought we could understand, and then managing it that way, in that very parochial way of seeing the world, it's actually been very destructive, right? It's been destructive to the environment, it's destructive to our societies, it's destructive to our relations with all people, all races, all genders, all the the variety of life in the human society, as well as our ecosystems.
Yes. I thought the two images that stick with me are, one, you talk about roots, like I'm going to get the science wrong, so just go with like the literary theme that I'm trying to pull out, but the trees that have the deep roots that can access water during drought, and that they bring it to the surface for trees with more shallow roots to access. I was thinking about that. My writing is about foster care, and about people have been asking, well, how do we fix foster care? How do we fix foster care? And it's such a question. Well, we have to fix structural poverty first. We have to fix our sense of what counts as a community. We have to fix racism, all the housing, all those things. And then you picking up the roots of those dying planted trees that were meant to be replanting a clear-cut area, and seeing how different they looked from other roots in the forest. And so I think that to me is like a socio-political argument as well. Like, we can't see things as isolated, and we can't see things as only competitive. It's communal, it's socialist, it's sharing, it's cooperative, and you really turn that worldview on its head in a really important way, I think.
I think just trying to bring a more holistic understanding to these complex relationships. It's not any one or the other of any one of those things. It's very highly evolved, it's highly intelligent, it's these systems work well, they've evolved to heal and to be productive, and when we start dismantling them, they lose that integrity, that resilience, and so it is so important.
I'm curious about your writing. I imagine that, I don't know if I think you're writing about your experience with cancer, and then you're writing about your brother. It's incredibly beautiful in the book. And I was wondering if you knew you would always write those personal parts, or if you had intended only to write about trees, or like, did you get forced to write that, or was that
That's
desire
a good
always
question.
there?
No, I was not forced to write about that. You know, I've published over 200 journal articles in scientific journals, and I've done that. All my work is peer reviewed. So the science is solid, and you know, writing science it's a craft, it's an art, but it has its limits, and I always wanted to write the fuller story of what the meaning of this science was. What's the life behind this? Like, it wasn't just a scientific endeavor that came from nothing. It was my life, right? It's how I grew up and what I saw that we were missing. And also as a woman, what I saw that we were missing. And so I wanted to have that fuller story out there. And I also love to write too. Ever since I was a kid, I love to write. So as a scientist, you get it drenched out of you, that creative part of writing. And so I wanted to write that part too. And I wanted, yeah, I also, you know, I was getting a little bit frustrated because I could see other people were writing popular science books about my work. And I was like, well, you know, okay, so that's a little slice of what I did. And it's like plunked into a bigger story of whatever they think is important. And I found that quite frustrating. And so I thought, I need to tell the whole story here. Like this science didn't just, it's not like a money or an apple growing on a tree. It's actually the whole tree. It's the whole forest. I need to explain this. And so that the writing about my brother, the writing about my cancer, all of that played a role, right? It all influenced my thinking. It informed my work, and my work informed how I dealt with it. So it was important for me to do that.
You write about grief really beautifully. I've had my own grief in my life in the past 2 years, and I also cross country skied to get through difficult parts of my life. So someday we'll have to cross country ski.
Yes, we will have to. Yeah, since we don't live that far apart.
No, because I found that really beautiful.
That would be so cool.
I wonder if you could talk. I've been an academic, and I also was in the church and got run out by sexism. So I'm wondering if you can talk about sexism in your profession, and how that part that you were called Miss Birch, as like, you know, a way of calling you another word without saying that word. I'm wondering how being a scientist and being a woman affected your research, your ideas, how other people perceived your findings. If you could talk a little bit about how you navigated that.
Yeah, you know, I think any woman, well, probably every woman understands, but you know, any woman that's worked in a male-dominated field knows it doesn't matter if you're a firefighter or a policeman or a scientist in a lab, or you know, if it's a male-dominated field and you're new in it, it's a tough road to hoe. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's pretty tough. And the more women you can get into those fields, the easier it becomes. But those pioneers that are just moving into it, boy, it's like you got to be a battering ram almost. You know, you got to put your head down, and yeah, the insults, the dismissal, just the exclusion is painful. And I don't think that men realize how destructive it is for women to go through this, and how we have to persist. And I think that persistence, you know, I mean, really, you know, as a girl growing up, even in a logging family, I kind of knew that from the beginning. It's kind of prepared me a little bit for it. But you just you sort of get into the survivalist mode, and you just keep going, right? You just got to go. So there was that, and it's gotten easier for me over time. Maybe it's because I'm older now, and I'm more established. But I think for girls and women coming up, it's also maybe a little easier because there's more of us women that have been in through it. But it's still going to have its challenges, and I would say don't give up, because what you bring to the field is so incredibly important. And so let me just talk a little bit about that. So, you know, in my field, you know, the field of forestry was dominated by men, and the science of forestry was dominated by men doing that science. And their views were that, you know, competition was the thing that mattered the most, especially competing for light, because that's what they could see. and this other, that species could actually collaborate or facilitate each other, help each other out, was like, are you kidding? But it was so important for me to bring that understanding to forestry, because the way I see it is like, it's like understanding forest with one eye closed, right? You only see half of it. And when you only see half of it, you make so many mistakes. And women bring a unique perspective. We see things differently. We have our own way of seeing how things fit together and work. And we can bring things together. We're very good at that sort of thing. And I don't mean that in a sexist sort of way at all, or it's one of our powers, right? It's one of our superpowers. And we as a society need to have all of our superpowers at play here, the women, and stick with it and do your thing, and don't let people try to distract you or put you down for your thoughts, or because you matter. What you're doing matters a lot.
How did you persist? Because it wasn't just, I think it wasn't just being a woman in science, it was actually having very ideas that they were practically mocking. I mean, and dismissing and calling it anthropomorphic, or whatever name calling they were doing. And I wonder what was it that gave you the, I don't know if courage is the right way, but
yeah, I mean, I think the anthropomorphism is just a recent thing since I wrote this book. That I haven't had that, or done a few films, and so that's pretty recent. And I would say that's another kind of dismissal, right? It's there's a reason for communicating this science using those words. It's so we can communicate and people can understand. It's also to bring this idea that we talked about earlier, that we are all, we are one with nature, netsamatsta, as according to the Homokaman language. And there's many words in the First Nations languages that we are all in this together, and we are all one. And I knew that we just had to get this idea, this way of seeing, of viewing the world. It became such important to me that I knew this was part of the missing thing. And so I just kept going. And I had already become a survivalist, because I had to, as a girl growing up in the bush. And so I always had that survival instinct. And that is really what carried me through all the difficulties. But yeah, so the anthropomorphism is recent. Back then, when I was in my late 20s, 30s, and I was having children, and I published in Nature my main results, the early results, and I was getting hit from all sides, academics, forestry, and it was tough. And my kids were, they were little teeny kids, and I was trying to be at home with my kids and deal with this negative stuff. And I got to this point actually where I thought, I'm not going to do this anymore. I thought I'm not going to look at connection in forests anymore. This is too hard. I can't deal with all this myself, right? And so I decided I was just going to do something easier. And I decided I was just going to study climate change, which is way more
something easier,
more straightforward. And so I did start doing that, but then I got this job in academia, and that sort of allowed me to ask more, to follow on my original lines of inquiry, which, when I worked for the government, they didn't really care that much about it. In fact, as we talked about, they tried to suppress it. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's also connected to your sense of the promise that you made. At least, like I heard that, whenever you write something or research something and you put it out in the world, at least for me, it's so vulnerable. I've had to set deep intentions for my writing practice, so that, like in this book, it's a love letter to my foster daughter. I wanted to write a book that would mother her when I was no longer allowed to. Now, when critics are saying things that are hurtful, it's like, well, I don't really care, because I set out for what I did. So I think there's a way where when you find that deeper purpose or that deeper meaning or that promise to the forest, that that can also help you.
It does on. Definitely. So I did have that higher purpose of and today, just to drive home the message, in British Columbia, where I grew up, I grew up in these forests. I grew up in a province of old growth forests. It's now a province of clear cut forests. Wow. And it's heartbreaking to watch. And now we have only 3% of our iconic old growth left. 3%, what the heck, right? And it's absolutely heartbreaking. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm driven to save these forests because, and to help people. I mean, people are literally blockading roads right now at Fairy Creek on southern Vancouver Island because they're so passionate about this, and they're right to be that way. And it's to all of our, they're doing us a favor because these old growth forests, which the government and industry are so intent on cutting down, are, that's where our biodiversity lives. That's where carbon is stored. That's where our clean water and clean air come from. Once those forests are gone, you just don't grow them back like carrots. It takes thousands of years, and we don't have thousands of years to grow back forests. We're at a crisis now, and so there is there is a higher purpose for our kids, for the upcoming generations, to all of us. That those of us who know. If you don't know, well, then those of us who do know, it's our job to make sure that we can spread the word so that we can inform people. Just like, the epidemiologists help the rest of us figure out how to deal with the coronavirus. Well, we as shepherds of the environment need to be out there, stand up there and say, no, this is not right. This is not good for any of us.
Yes. That's so powerful. I know Rick is going to come back on for questions, so I'll ask you one more. But you just talked about how we need to save the forest. But in the beginning, you write, this is not a book about how we save trees. This is a book about how trees might save us. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about what you mean about that? By that?
Yeah, it's because trees, plants are, especially, they're our ancestors, and they, as I've talked about, they co-evolved with fungi over millions of years. And they develop photosynthetic machinery, that incredible biochemistry that is the origin of our lives, that produces oxygen, that filters our water ultimately through higher level organisms. They basically keep the earth in balance, right? It's the biosphere that's in balance. And that is what's made it a hospitable environment for us to live in. And in our whole, our whole solar system, as far as we know, we're the only planet that has life like this. And it's a result of all these organisms working together, evolving to create this. And we've evolved in it too, right? We've evolved over millions of years to live in this environment. And here we are, we're disrupting the whole thing because we were blind to it. Now we can see enough that this is so destructive. But those trees are there, they're regenerative. They're stressed out right now. They're crying for help. I was, metaphorically, and they need us to help. And it's our responsibility to do that. It's a responsibility to us, our kids, our whole families, but yeah, because to let them do their job of saving us, of providing the life support system that we have evolved to live in.
So beautiful. And I'm not, you said it's metaphoric that they're crying, but some of the research is they are. I mean, they can send distress signals, right? And they
definitely can send stress signals. Yes. Through the air, through the soil, in their own bodies, there's this whole cascade of stress that happens that we can easily measure. So yeah, that is a cry.
I read your work, and then I went to do trail maintenance at a trail near my house, and they assigned me the task of trimming branches so mountain bikers would have more room. And I was just like weeping, trimming the branches. And they thought, who is this like weird lady? And I was like, I just read about trees. They communicate, they remember, they're connected. This is
and they would be sending signals to each other saying, hey, Sarah's here cutting my branches.
Cutting my branch. I know, which is why I was weeping. But I have to just say to everyone, you should definitely buy this book, Finding the Mother Tree. It's so beautiful. I had the privilege of reading it straight through, and it's gorgeous, and it will shift the way you look at what it means to be alive, what it means to share the planet with trees, what it means to be part of this large ecosystem that we're a small part, and we're dependent on each other. And so thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Whew. Sarah, thank you. Also, I'm just going to come in here a little bit with some of the questions that you're putting in, and please do, if you are listening, have other questions. One thing I will say is, as these programs go, because of the times of day and people having other things going on in life, usually you start out with a certain attendance, and it starts going down. It's gone up. I think people are telling other people, you got to log in and see what's going on, because it's just been so. Both of you have been lit up, and Suzanne, it's been amazing. So the questions, let's see, I'll do these from the Q&A. Carl asks, and you said some of this, or I think asking about coastal forests that have scattered old growth fir trees with major conch rot. Do these trees provide nutrition to the younger surrounding forests? It's a real basic question.
Yeah, so the experiments we've done where we've actually infected trees with pathogens. So I think the conch rot he's thinking of as a heart rot. And we've worked more with root rots, but where we infect these trees and they actually do transmit messages to their neighbors, warning them, and then the neighbors will eavesdrop on these messages that are transmitted through the mycorrhizal networks that link them all together. And so, yeah, there is, as those trees are dying, as they become infected and dying, that's a process. And that process includes communicating with their neighbors about defense and also distributing their energy to certain neighbors, especially kin neighbors, which we found. So yeah, I mean, it does elicit when you get an infection or a disease or an infestation, that elicits all kinds of signaling that goes on in these communities. It's just like the talking or the communication between the trees really lights up.
Okay. Grayson asks, here in Seattle, as an apartment dweller, what can I do to help the need for the diversity of trees and plants and forests that you've explored?
Yeah, well, there's so many things people can do, and I think that's important. That's a really important message that, I think that, these days it's easy to feel hopeless, especially during the coronavirus where we feel isolated, and how can we connect with other people and do some meaningful things? And there's so much you can do. I mean, the first thing that if you're living in an apartment is to just, go find a park or a boulevard or a forest, or even grow a plant in your apartment or on your deck, and grow consortiums of plants and watch how they interact with each other. And just by doing those simple acts, you start to understand the forest more, and also just to love it more. And that's the fundamental foundation for then what you do next, right? Because to put yourself out there and do something to, like if you're going to protest, or like they're doing in Southern Vancouver Island, you really got to, that's a huge effort, and we all have busy lives and it's difficult. But really it's come to the point, at least in Canada, and I think, you've got in the States similar issues, that saving these last bits of untouched land is absolutely crucial. And it's going to take a transformational effort. It's not trivial, and governments are hard to move, right? They're so entrenched in what they do, and their policies and practices are like moving at glacial speed, but we don't have time for that. So we have to instigate change that is more rapid, it's transformational. And if you're going to put yourself out there to really be part of that, you got to love the forest and see that higher purpose. And then of course, simpler things, how you vote really matters. And I think, we see that from election to election, how our lives and how the policies change. Like, look what the difference between Trump and Biden, right? What a huge difference. And, Biden is doing some great things for climate change that are meaningful, right? That are going to help decarbonize the future. And when you put those little things in place by voting for for progressive governments that are, that honor regenerative kinds of practices, and they start putting these little things in place, they add up to a whole lot really fast, and that it can make a huge difference for making it a better environment, better for the forest, better for the trees.
Thank you. And Grayson, I'd say, I'm not knowing for sure, but do read this book. That'll also help you distill things. Shiraz asks about comparing fruit trees and non-fruit trees. For example, olive, mango, and avocado have long lifespans, and do these trees connect with each other?
So I don't know enough about the specific trees, all of them, but I will say that all trees all over the world are dependent on these mycorrhizal relationships for getting nutrients and water from the soil. And I think most of the ones you just talked about, well, all of it anyway, they form arbuscular mycorrhizas, just like the cedar, yew, and maple that I talked about. And yeah, so those mycorrhizal networks that they enter into, and all just the relationship with the fungi, the symbiosis is important for their fitness for them to able to survive and produce fruit and then carry on to the next generation. So conserving those connections in the soil between the trees is really super important. And I have to say, you know, with climate change, we're getting more severe fires, and I know people are worried about fire severity and how that might affect these networks, and it will, right? It will affect the networks. Yeah, so it's important that we try to keep them intact as much as possible. That doesn't mean like putting out the fires, because fires are also necessary for regeneration of our forests all over the world, most places, not all, but most. And they're adapted to fire. It's just these, you know, really severe fires where we can actually lose these networks. And so, yeah, I think that's going beyond a little bit about the question, but those trees that he mentioned are mycorrhizal.
Yeah, good. Two people, Barbara and Jim, each ask a question. Barbara a little more generally, and Jim with more specifics about invasives. And I'll read Jim's comes in a little more with, he's got the language here. Is there much known about the presence of invasive tree species like white mulberry and how they affect the fungal mycorrhizal networks which native trees use to communicate? Also, do allelopathic trees have any adverse impact on the mycorrhizal networks due to the compounds they exude into the soil?
Yeah. So the first part of the question, and I'll try to remember the second part.
We can come back with it, yes.
Yeah. So the first part of the question is about invasive trees. And so Douglas fir has been planted all over the world as an exotic invasive, and actually become naturalized in places like New Zealand and Northern Europe. And but when it was first introduced to New Zealand, it didn't have the mycorrhizal symbionts that went with it, right? They just took the seed and tried to grow seedlings and plant them out, and they didn't survive, or they did very poorly. And so it wasn't until they figured out, well, they need their symbionts too, and moved those over to New Zealand, that they actually were able to establish these trees and as whole systems, whole forests. And so, yeah, so all these trees need their symbionts if they're going to be successful invaders. A lot of invasive plants, and I don't know, you know, so I guess a lot of invasive plants are non-mycorrhizal, but that doesn't include trees actually. So things like cheatgrass, you know, a lot of those really invasive plants, they reproduce a lot. A lot of them don't need mycorrhizas. Actually, cheatgrass does have arbuscular mycorrhizas. I take that back, but some of them just don't have them. And or if they do, they'll tap into the networks that exist in the natural communities and actually extract resources from them and steal the resources from them. So, you know, they can be, and that creates holes in these natural communities that invasives can actually get into the communities. So it's a complex story with them. And as far as the allelochemicals in, you know, like trees like black walnut that produce allelochemicals, do they transmit through networks? I don't know, but my guess is probably. We know that herbicides, for example, can move through mycorrhizal networks. So, and we know that, you know, defense enzymes can, and probably those allelochemicals are, you know, I don't know for sure, but a lot of them probably are defense, some sort of defense chemicals, and we know those move through the network. So without having done the exact studies, my guess is that yes, that they would.
Rand asks a question, which I can't remember the science now, that was talked about when you linked the maple, the yew, and cedar, that you were talking about the newer research. But Rand's question is, do old big leaf maples act as mother trees?
Yeah, I mean, any tree, as long as it's the biggest, oldest tree in the forest, acts like a mother tree, or the biggest, oldest tree in its network. And certainly big leaf maples, when they're mature, there can be huge trees, and yeah, they would be mother trees as well, in their own, you know, separate network from, say, the Douglas firs that may be associated with them that have their own mother trees. So it's, you know, it's a dynamic, complex system, and it's not, and we have to be careful not to simplify it down to one or two trees, because these trees, they grow, you know, they taller, and then they shrink back, and then others will grow taller. It's a dynamic life cycle, and what was a seedling suppressed in the understory at one time will be a mother tree later on in its life. So it's, yeah, so the short answer is yes, those maples can be.
One thing, a little observation, because this goes, as you did when you and Sarah were talking about you were mentioning the student who's helped you or is doing this work that you're working with on the Maple Yew and Cedar, and it's in your book too. You credit younger students and you name them, and they're often young women, and acknowledge their work, because it's a lot of people in a lot of fields, they're the senior person. They take the credit for what, at least, and if maybe nameless younger assistants are mentioned, but you actually acknowledging is also a good thing and important thing, and to be commended. So
and they did the work. I mean, they, that's their graduate degrees, and I did my graduate degree, and I was able to build on that work, and they'll build on their work, and they need the support of us elders to to boost them up. Yeah.
Well, no, that it's the intergenerational part that also, I don't think science, Western science is that kind with that helping people in that way. And the science is not the only thing. Nola asks, says, I recently learned about ghost stumps that are kept alive by trees around them. You know what makes it so some stumps are kept alive this way and others not?
Yeah, actually Douglas fir is a really good example that does that. I call them living stumps, but so a lot of tree species will graft with their own species, so they share cambium. So that's one avenue that sugars are transported from one tree to another, but of course through their mycorrhizal networks as well. So there's multiple avenues through which these stumps will actually get sugars from live neighboring trees that feed into the phloem of the stump, and it'll actually grow the phloem will grow, and bark will grow right over the top of the stump. And so it keeps it alive. It keeps the root systems alive. It's just a subsidy from the living trees around it. So the stump is, the cambium and the phloem is alive, but the it's not ever going to have an apical meristem that's going to form another tree. It's basically just being subsidized by the other trees around it. And that stuff has a purpose too, right? It provides habitat for animals like squirrels and chipmunks and so on, and salamanders. But also they're sort of like intermediaries that can help link the whole forest together, because this tree is connected to that stump that's connected to that tree, that, so they help keep the forest cohesive.
Yes. Jay Davis, that's just the initial J, gives, we're sort of wending back and forth here in different directions. Okay, an impossible question. What's been the most effective way you've found, besides writing the book, which is I think will be effective, to change hearts and minds of people who have not been heretofore sympathetic or open to a more expansive vision of the world, and such as you're talking about?
Yeah, I think one thing is, hearts and minds, grassroots movements, getting the vaccine out there. Those are all small things that start small, right? And I think, ecologists are starting to think of systems as complex adaptive systems, and that's what we're talking about, is that it's like all the people, all the naysayers, the people who are who understand the work and invite the work, people who don't, they communicate, they interact, they create an idea, and and slowly the system will start to change, especially if you have thought leaders, right? Thought leaders are really, really important in changing hearts and minds. And I think that slowly, and this is how this knowledge has happened as well, that, it's ignored at first. It was published, but it was ignored, it's ridiculed. And then there's a little more work done, and it's like, oh, maybe it's important. And then, a little bit more work is done, and it elevates a little bit. And then there can be like these transformational moments, these milestones that really move things quickly. That's how systems work, right? You get that thought leader or that mother tree, or, enough of the conversation going that suddenly you get a shift, and those shifts are starting to happen, right? And it's a accumulation of many things that actually move the needle, and I feel like it is moving, and that's very hopeful, and we need that hope. We really need that hope, because it keeps people motivated. For example, I just got a note tonight from the protesters on the blockades at Prairie Creek, and they're getting tired, right? Because they're not getting enough support, and there's not enough movement from the politicians to save those old growth forests. But slowly, with gathering support, at least there's, it will happen. I feel like, with enough understanding and enough people pushing, that system will shift. And that is how complex systems work. And that is the hopeful thing about them.
Sarah, do you have anything else at this point?
No, the only thing that I don't think we've talked about is your idea that mother trees don't only tend their own young, but they tend strangers, which as an adoptive parent and as a foster parent really resonated for me. So I don't know if you want to talk at all about that idea of taking care of, the trees that don't belong, that aren't theirs in some kind of way.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So, we got so stuck on Darwinian competition, survival of the fittest, and carrying on genes. The speciation that we forgot, or we hadn't advanced, and we're only just starting to advance to the understanding communities, right? Communities are consortiums of all kinds of creatures in forests. That includes like other species of trees, or also the same species, or even related individuals within a species. All of those are important in creating community. And trees, or mother trees, will share almost as much nutrition, carbon, support for other species as for their own. And it's because my understanding is, after watching and studying forests my entire life, is that a diversity of species, a diversity of individuals make a healthy community, that makes the community cohesive and strong. And if it was all one thing, it's very vulnerable and ultimately collapses. And so, yeah, so species mixes, and now we know, really, very careful studies showing that diversity actually does increase health and productivity of ecosystems. There's solid science on that. And, and it's also like shown in my work as well, that this collaboration among species is real, it's there, it's important to the community, it's important to the health of the community in very concrete ways.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Another question that came in, and this probably draws on that you have been are in academia, but also worked in government and worked for logging companies back in the day. And it's Rand, who lives in Whatcom County, just over the border from Vancouver, who asks that there is a conserved old growth forest with yellow cedar that's 1,000 years old plus, and 800-year-old mountain hemlocks. How can that get studied from the perspective you developed? I mean, I don't know if that's a matter of asking other colleges, or who does the studies, is that, or the government, or who does that work?
For individual patches of forest, of course, you have universities in Washington and all over the United States and all over the world that would be interested, I'm sure, in studying those patches of forest. Of course, there's only so many resources to go around, and only so much energy that scientists have. But probably the most important thing that you could do as an individual for that patch of forest is to get to know it yourself and learn about what's going on with it, and what are the pressures on it, and try to alleviate those pressures in some way. Because all these these old growth patches are vulnerable now because they're surrounded by by urban areas. They're undergoing stresses with climate change, and they do need our attention. And so I would say, if you don't have a university that's studying that patch of forest, you could ask them to, but even yourself, you can get involved in it in many ways. Each individual can get involved in it, and it helps. It's really important to do that.
And then also on the practical level, even more practical level, very basic, a question from Jim about when planting native tree saplings, is there anything humans can do to encourage and accelerate the development of mycorrhizal networks, such as adding mushroom compost or other fungal material to the root zone?
Yeah, so if you're on a piece of land that's really degraded, if it's lost its forest flora or the organic material, then it's important to add inoculum back in, because it can be, it could have lost it, right? If it's been in an abandoned agricultural field, for example, for a long time, it's really hard to get trees to grow back in those because the fungal inoculum has basically died out. And so then you need to bring it in. And And usually that fungal inoculum, the commercial inoculums that you can get, or you could bring in soil from a surrounding forest, those fungi will help the trees get established, but then it'll disappear also fairly quickly, because at least that's what the studies show, that the natural community will take over in time as soon as once those trees get going. But at the beginning, it's important to make sure they have a good, healthy inoculum. That might mean adding it in.
Circling back a little bit to, you mentioned part of writing this book was others were using your work, and this question actually, though, is about what's been widely reported as this is a work of fiction, the Overstory. Some version of your life and your work were depicted there. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that?
I love the Overstory. I think it's a wonderful book. It's a beautiful piece of literature. I loved reading it. The stories, the twining of the stories together, and I'm proud that he used my character, actually, that he developed his character partly on me. I think it's wonderful, and it really brings to light. People love fiction. They love reading stories. They love storytelling. And even if it's fiction that's embedded some science in it, that's okay, because it makes people understand this, or it allows them to be open and understand it. So, kudos to Richard Powers for writing such a beautiful book and getting people engaged in forest and this idea of plant communication as well. And the difficulties that female scientists go through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Since we're on that subject, and people who know me know I'm usually about the last one to report on this kind of news, but Finding the Mother Trees could be a movie too, like a Hollywood, like a feature movie. Could you say a little about what? I can't, because I don't even know who the names of other people have said, ooh, the so-and-so's going to be in it and direct producing it. Who's involved with this?
Yeah, so I have an agent, Doug Abrams, at Idea Architects, and he had the idea that this would be might be a good feature film. And so he went to William Morris Entertainment and said, hey, what do you think? And we wrote a kind of a little treatment, or I wrote a little treatment that I thought would be a good pitch for a movie. And I think at first they were like, I don't know. And then when they went out and pitched it, it was like, oh my God, it was competitive, right? So ultimately the person who got the film was Amy Adams, and she's collaborating with a production company called 9 Stories with Jake Gyllenhaal. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Jake Gyllenhaal and Reva Marker. And so we've got this, this very strong team that's going to produce this movie. I think it's wonderful.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Maybe you have to have a character model after Richard Powers, since you could play around a little bit. With very similar.
It's funny, my brother's son is Matthew Kelly Charles Simard, and my brother passed away before Matthew was born. And Matthew, so he never knew his dad, but he's a cowboy. He became a cowboy, and he said to me, Auntie, do you think I could play my dad in the movie? And I thought, what a beautiful thing. So actually, I've never said this actually before publicly, and I really haven't asked WME either, but I think that would be so cool to blend the real life characters with these actresses, these amazing actors and actresses. Yeah.
Well, that would be something to see when that all happens, and that'll be something else. I think unless there's anyone, I think the questions we've come through, I think everyone's got a lot to carry around with this. I don't know how you're good, Suzanne, how you wind down after these, but this has been remarkable. And I do, if we were in a room together, which I both wish we were, but I actually would rather, if we're going to be together, we were outside somewhere where we could be among some trees and having this as a gathering. But there've been some other wonderful writers among us, and 2 of them, Grace Cho, who's reading for Elliott Bay on June 10th, and as poet Sylvia Pollack on May 24th are here, but also Charlotte Gill, whom we spoke about earlier, and Nikki McClure and Sonia Lee, and a few others are among those. But I know there's other people here, academics who are doing good work, and other activist people here doing good work, and
thank you guys thank you everybody for being here.
I've gotten some texts about people just going wow, saying that during the course of this. So thank you so much, both. And Suzanne, this is, yeah, well, we do hope when things open up again and that we can get you down here to visit and do something in person, and
I'd be happy. I'd be delighted to.
get you.
Yes, and
Maybe
maybe I'll get to go to Idaho and go skiing with Sarah.
Yeah, let's go skiing,
And we
please.
can maybe write together.
I would love that.
Wouldn't that
Yes,
be cool? Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
I'm into it. Please, yes.
Yeah.
this is
that'd be
this
so
also
cool.
these forms of connection. I mean, watching the two of you in the way that you talk about these, there's the slow way, and then there's the sort of the sudden way. And I think watching you two connect. I mean, I've never met Suzanne before this, but I had reading and seeing things of her, and I thought I thought you and Sarah could hit it off. And I think it's certainly been
Yeah.
what you've done here tonight. So thank you both, and thank you so much for this good work, this incredibly beautiful, vital, important work. And we will carry on, and everyone stay safe, and say hello to the trees that you
Yes.
know. That's why I don't know what trees will be in the movie when that time comes.
Hopefully Doug.
Yes,
Yeah.
Doug, not a character. Doug.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you.
Again, Sarah. Thanks. Yeah. And
Thank you so
thank you.
much. This is great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Ben.
thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
Okay.
Bye.
Good night.